Canada and the United States, the second and third largest countries in the world by land area, share the longest international border on Earth, stretching about 8,900 kilometers, 5,525 miles. It extends from the Atlantic coast in the east all the way to the Pacific coast in the west, passing through endless forests, massive lakes, and vast stretches of untouched wilderness. What's remarkable is that this is also one of the most peaceful international borders in the world. There are no giant border walls, no heavily fortified checkpoints, and none of the prolonged military standoffs seen in many other parts of the world. But what makes this border especially famous among geographers isn't just its peaceful nature. It's not only the perfectly straight line cutting through dense forests. It's also because of one very unusual population pattern. Most Canadians live in a narrow band of land close to the U.S. border. Major cities such as Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, and Vancouver are all located relatively close to the United States. The farther north you travel, the fewer people you see. Eventually, the population becomes extremely sparse and then almost disappears altogether. Millions of square kilometers of Canadian territory contain virtually no large population centers. This creates a fascinating paradox. Canada is the second largest country in the world after Russia, covering nearly 10 million square kilometers. Yet most of its population lives within a relatively narrow strip of land along the U.S. border. Many people say that around 90% of Canadians live near the United States. It sounds like an exaggeration, but when you look at a population map of Canada, that statement isn't far from the truth. Even the country's biggest international events take place in cities near the American border. For example, during the 2026 FIFA World Cup, Canada's matches will be hosted in just two cities, Toronto and Vancouver. Both are located in the southernmost part of the country, close to the U.S. border. Toronto sits on the shores of Lake Ontario, only a little over 100 kilometers from the United States as the crow flies. Meanwhile, Vancouver is only about 50 kilometers from the U.S. state of Washington. So even when Canada hosts the World Cup, it still can't escape its population belt along the U.S. border. That's because most Canadians, businesses, international airports, and modern infrastructure are concentrated in this region. But why? To answer that question, let's first talk about Canada's size. Canada is an enormous country. Its territory stretches across nearly 10 million square kilometers, making it larger than the United States, larger than China, and roughly 30 times the size of Vietnam. However, having a vast amount of land doesn't mean all of it is suitable for people to live on. Most of Canada lies at very high latitudes, extending all the way into the Arctic. And that's an extremely difficult place for human settlement. Winters are long. Temperatures are extremely low. In many parts of northern Canada, winter temperatures below minus 30 degrees Celsius are completely normal. During the coldest periods, temperatures can even fall to minus 40 or minus 50 degrees Celsius. Under conditions like these, building cities, developing agriculture, maintaining industries, or sustaining economic activity becomes incredibly challenging. And it's not just the cold. Large areas of northern Canada sit on permafrost, permanently frozen ground. That makes infrastructure construction much more expensive. Every road, neighborhood, or factory has to be specially designed to withstand frozen soil. Even maintaining water systems, electricity, and transportation networks is far more difficult than in temperate regions. So although Canada possesses an enormous territory, much of its northern land is better described as a vast storehouse of natural resources than an ideal place for large populations to live. Naturally, people tend to settle where life is easier, and those places happen to be in southern Canada. And southern Canada happens to be right next to the United States. If northern Canada is a vast, frozen wilderness, then southern Canada is the complete opposite. This part of the country enjoys a much milder climate, warmer summers, more fertile land, and far better transportation networks. In particular, the region surrounding the Great Lakes is considered the population heart of Canada. These enormous freshwater lakes act like natural climate regulators, making the surrounding areas significantly more temperate. That's why Canada's largest cities are concentrated here. Toronto, the country's largest city, sits on the shores of Lake Ontario. Montreal developed along the St. Lawrence River. Ottawa, the nation's capital, lies at the crossroads of major transportation and trade routes. This region has abundant freshwater, productive farmland, convenient transportation, and ideal conditions for industry. It's no coincidence that the provinces of Ontario and Quebec together account for more than half of Canada's population. They offer the country's best living conditions, the greatest job opportunities, and are home to most of Canada's economic activity. But climate is only part of the story. The other part comes from history. When the first French settlers arrived in Canada during the 16th and 17th centuries, they didn't push north into the Arctic. Instead, they settled along the St. Lawrence River, where conditions were far more favorable for building communities. Later, the British followed the same pattern. Canada's first cities, first ports, and first commercial centers all emerged in the southern part of the country. As trade routes developed, more people moved into these areas. Where people settled, businesses followed. As businesses grew, more jobs were created. Then came schools, hospitals, banks, and every other service a growing population needed. It's the classic snowball effect of urban development. Once an area becomes an economic center, it naturally attracts even more people. Like a snowball rolling downhill, it keeps getting bigger. For more than 300 years, that pattern has remained largely unchanged. As a result, southern Canada has become increasingly populated, while much of the north has remained sparsely inhabited, much as it was centuries ago. If climate is the first reason, and history is the second, then the economy is the third. And today, it's probably the most powerful factor of all. Canada has a very special neighbor, the United States, the world's largest economy. Every year, the two countries exchange trillions of dollars worth of goods and services. Roughly 3/4 of Canada's exports are sold to the United States. That alone has encouraged much of Canada's economic activity to remain close to the border. Take another look at the map. Toronto isn't far from the United States. Vancouver sits just north of Seattle. Windsor lies directly across the river from Detroit. And Montreal is also relatively close to the densely populated northeastern United States. None of this is a coincidence. Businesses want to be close to the world's largest consumer market. Manufacturers want to be close to their customers. Workers want to live where the jobs are. The result is exactly what you'd expect. People continue to concentrate in southern Canada. You could even say that the United States acts like a giant economic magnet. It doesn't pull Canadians across the border, but it does pull Canada's economic centers toward the border. And wherever the economy goes, the population follows. So why doesn't Canada simply encourage tens of millions of people to move north? After all, there's plenty of empty land up there. Why not build more cities and spread the population across the country? In reality, this is one of the biggest challenges Canada has faced for decades. For a city to function, people need roads, airports, electricity, clean water, internet access, hospitals, schools, and countless other public services. Building all of that in the Arctic is dramatically more expensive than building it in southern Canada. Some northern communities can only be reached by airplane for most of the year. Others rely on temporary ice roads that form over frozen lakes and rivers during the winter. When spring arrives and the ice melts, those roads simply disappear. Imagine how expensive it is to transport construction materials, food, fuel, and everyday supplies to places like these. That's why, despite Canada's enormous land area, much of the North simply isn't an attractive place for either people or businesses. The concentration of population in southern Canada has created several major challenges today. The first is soaring housing prices in cities like Toronto and Vancouver. It's a fascinating paradox. Canada has nearly 10 million square kilometers of land, yet it's still facing a housing crisis. The reason is simple. People don't want to live in remote, freezing regions far from jobs and services. They want to live where opportunities exist. And those opportunities are concentrated within a relatively small part of the country, right next to the U.S. border. The second consequence is Canada's heavy dependence on its southern economic corridor. Most of the country's population, businesses, universities, factories, and industrial centers are located there. That concentration makes Canada's economy highly efficient. But it also means the country relies heavily on a handful of major metropolitan areas. Another important factor is immigration. Every year, Canada welcomes hundreds of thousands of new immigrants. However, the vast majority choose to settle in Toronto, Vancouver, or Montreal, rather than moving to remote northern communities. As a result, Canada's population has become even more concentrated in the south than ever before. Although most Canadians still live in the southern part of the country, northern Canada is far from being forgotten. In fact, it's receiving more attention than ever. One major reason is climate change. As Arctic ice gradually melts, new shipping routes may become available in the future. At the same time, beneath those vast, remote landscapes lie enormous reserves of oil, natural gas, minerals, and precious metals. Because of this, the Canadian government has been investing more heavily in northern infrastructure, military capabilities, and scientific research. The goal is not only to protect Canada's Arctic sovereignty, but also to prepare for new economic opportunities that could emerge in the years ahead. Even so, experts agree that it's highly unlikely northern Canada will ever become home to tens of millions of people. The harsh climate, the extreme distances, and the enormous cost of development. Those challenges aren't going away anytime soon. So, for at least the next several decades, most Canadians will continue living close to their southern neighbor, the United States. Even if northern Canada becomes more developed in the future, it's still very unlikely to become home to tens of millions of people. The harsh climate and the country's vast geography will remain major obstacles for generations to come. That's why, for the foreseeable future, most Canadians will continue living as neighbors to the United States. When you look at a map, Canada's population distribution might seem strange at first. The country is almost 10 million square kilometers in size, yet the overwhelming majority of its people live close to one border. But once you understand the geography, the history, and the economy, it all starts to make sense. The North is enormous, but it's cold, remote, and expensive to develop. The South offers a milder climate, fertile farmland, well-established cities, and direct access to the world's largest economy. For centuries, people naturally settled where life was easier. And over time, those early settlements grew into Canada's largest cities. Today, that same pattern continues. Most businesses are there. Most universities are there. Most industries are there. Most newcomers to Canada choose to settle there. And naturally, that's where most Canadians choose to build their lives. So the famous claim that Canadians all live near the U.S. border isn't just an interesting statistic. It's the result of geography, history, and economics working together over hundreds of years. Canada may be one of the largest countries on Earth. But when it comes to where people actually live, only a relatively small part of that vast land is truly ideal for large-scale settlement. Perhaps that's what makes Canada so unique. It has endless wilderness, towering mountains, frozen Arctic landscapes, and millions of square kilometers where nature still dominates. Yet almost all of its people have gathered within a narrow southern corridor, creating one of the most unusual population distributions anywhere in the world. And that's why Canada remains one of the world's greatest geographic paradoxes, one of the biggest countries on the planet, with most of its people living surprisingly close to just one border. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who loves discovering fascinating facts about our world. Here at World of Why, every place has a story, and every story begins with one simple question. Why? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.